All right, Daniel is the last of what are often termed the major prophets. I think we've talked briefly in the past about the difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets. It has nothing to do with their message or their importance. It just simply has to do with the relative length of their particular books that are a part of that. So a lot of times, instead of me talking about major prophets and minor prophets, I just usually refer to the prophets. 17 books of the prophets. But Daniel is the last of those that are often referred to as major. He's one of only two prophets, the other being Ezekiel that we studied last week, whose work was done entirely during the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people. Daniel is one who would rise from just another Jewish captive to a man who obtained high respect and even high authority in both the Babylonian and Persian empires. And his book is a fascinating one. It's one of my favorites in the Old Testament. All right, quick facts. The name Daniel means God is my judge. The book was written by Daniel. He's the one, in other words, responsible for the contents of the book. The first 6 chapters, and we'll talk about that division between chapters 6 and 7 in just a moment, but the first 6 chapters speak of Daniel in the third person. Daniel did this. He said that. Beginning in chapter 7, verse 2, he changes to the first person. I, Daniel, saw this. And so you have that difference in perspective from between chapter 6 and 7, or beginning with chapter 7. But Daniel's the one responsible for the contents of the book. The history covers, you can see the dates there, from 606 to 536 BC. Daniel dates the beginning of the contents of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, which is 606. 2, the last date that we have a specific reference to in the book is in chapter 10, verse 1, the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, which would be 536. Daniel was contemporary with Jeremiah. They overlapped. Kind of the end of Jeremiah's work was right at the beginning of Daniel's, and Ezekiel also, we mentioned him. And as far as the historical books of the Old Testament and where Daniel fits, you're looking at 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 and 2 Chronicles chapter 36, or at least a portion of that chapter. All right, we have a lot of ground to cover. Like this any different than any other Wednesday night, right? Reader's Guide. All right, some things to keep in mind as you read through and study Daniel. I would say in the first place, take notice as you read through the book of Daniel's character. Primarily in those first 6 chapters, which are more historical in nature. You'll not that there's nothing about his character in the latter part of the book, but primarily that first section of the book, chapters 1 through 6. Here are just a few highlights that I found and think are important. You may find other tidbits about his character in different places. His devotion to God. Daniel was devoted to God above all else, which is obviously a commendable trait under any circumstance, but especially when you consider that Daniel was in an environment where that devotion would be harder than it may have been in other places. Daniel's work was primarily done in the palace of the Babylonian kings, and then of course he bleeds over a little bit into the early part of the Persian dynasty, but primarily during the Babylonian dominance. And so you have, but you still have references to his commitment to maintaining his faithfulness to God. Chapter 1, verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart, he resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. And so he devised a plan by which he would be able to continue to live there and not get in trouble, but maintain his faithfulness to God. In chapter 5, before the last of the Babylonian kings, when Daniel sees, or the king, they all see, this hand that writes on the wall, and Daniel interprets that. And the interpretation of that prophecy was one that required Daniel to deliver some very unpleasant news to that Babylonian king. Specifically, your kingdom is about to fall. And he told him why. Chapter 5, verse 23, because the God who holds your breath in his hand, you have not honored and glorified. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And your kingdom is about to be taken from you and given to the Medes and the Persians. Well, that took a lot of courage, but Daniel had it. He was devoted to God. Chapter 6, when the decree is made, the law is put in place that no one was to pray to any other god. They could only make petition of the king. Daniel prayed anyway. So several things in the book that show his commitment and his devotion to God above all else. He was a man of prayer. Again, chapter 6, right? He prays to God anyway. Chapter 9 records a lengthy prayer that Daniel prayed with regard to the ending of the captivity. It's an interesting thing. In chapter 9, we're told that Daniel recognized, based upon the prophetic work of Jeremiah. Daniel was familiar with Jeremiah's work. And he knew, based upon that familiarity with what Jeremiah said, that Jeremiah had predicted that the captivity would last 70 years. And based upon the dates, he knew that they're coming up on that time period. And so he prays to God that God would keep his promise and release the people. And that lengthy prayer is a beautiful prayer. One of the best in all of Scripture, much less just the Old Testament. So Daniel was a man of prayer. Daniel faithfully used the gifts that God gave him. And specifically, I have in mind the ability to interpret the dreams and visions of others. God gave him that ability, and he used it. Chapters 2 through 5. You have Daniel being given consecutive opportunities to use that gift, and he did. God also gave him visions of his own, chapters 7 through 12, but that ability to interpret the visions and dreams of others, Daniel used it, and he used it to God's glory, which is the next point. Daniel was careful never to take credit for what God was responsible for. We see this in chapter 2. It's not the only place, but it's a good example. Chapter 2, verses 27 to 30. As Daniel was about to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel answered the king. The question comes to him in verse 26. Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there's a God in heaven. Daniel didn't come in when he was at, can you interpret this dream? Daniel didn't say, absolutely, I can do that. No problem. No, he said, there's not a man alive that can do what you're asking to be done. But there's a God in heaven, and he can do it. And so Daniel was very quick to give God glory and credit for what was rightfully what God deserved. God was the one responsible for that. And so that's a good testament to his character. And then you've got elsewhere in Scripture where Daniel's character is commended. Ezekiel did it. I think we mentioned that passage last week in our study of Ezekiel, that when Ezekiel was talking about how wicked Jerusalem had become, and it was in the context of him talking about the fact that even though these false prophets were saying that the captivity is not going to last long, Ezekiel was saying, no, it is going to last long. Jerusalem is going to fall. And he made the point that even if Noah, Job, or Daniel were living among the people of Jerusalem, it wouldn't have any effect. It still wouldn't save the city. And so Daniel's commended. Jesus refers to Daniel the prophet. Matthew 24, verse 15. So Jesus recognized Daniel as a true prophet of God. There's I wouldn't say an obscure reference, but an indirect reference to Daniel in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 34, after the writer there had gone through listing all these people with faith as a great characteristic. By faith Abel did this, and by faith Noah did that. Well, as he gets to the end, he kind of throws out just kind of, and time would fail me to talk about all these other people. And he gave some characteristics of the different kinds of people that had this kind of faith. And he mentions one who through faith, or just mentions in passing, those who through faith stopped the mouths of lions. Well, that has to be an indirect reference, at least to Daniel chapter 6. Perhaps there were others that were in a similar fate that Scripture just didn't record for us. And so Daniel's character is commended by others. So as you read through, just take note of what a special man, what high character Daniel exhibited. I would say this too, in studying Daniel, that while obviously Daniel is the personality at the forefront of the narrative, I mean, the book's named after him, after all, and he is, again, the person that's at the forefront of all of that, and there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from him, from his character and all of that. But all of that said, ultimately, the book of Daniel is about God. And more importantly, or more specifically, it's about the sovereignty of God. How the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever he will. Daniel 4:25. So the book is about the authority of God, God's authority over and his guidance of his own world, and how that sovereignty is revealed in the lives of the personalities in the book. So you see the sovereignty of God at work in the life of Daniel as God brings certain things about in Daniel's life. And you see the sovereignty of God as he expresses it in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, or as it's seen in the lives of his three friends in chapter 3. And as God reveals his sovereignty to Daniel in certain visions, well, and even to Nebuchadnezzar, that Daniel interprets the dream. But in these dreams and visions, you see the sovereignty of God as he lays out, here's what's going to happen in the future with these world empires that exist now and that are going to exist in the future. So yes, the book's about Daniel, but it's not just about Daniel. It's really, in including Daniel, it's really a book about the sovereignty of God. Look at these examples of that. Chapter 1, verse 2. I know all those numbers are kind of squished together, but hopefully you can pick those out. Chapter 1, verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Okay, it doesn't just say that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took Jehoiakim. That's true, but the writer words it the way he words it by inspiration of the Holy Spirit for a reason. And he says specifically, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into the hand of the Babylonians. So the Babylonian captivity was an expression of what? Sovereignty of God. And how God was making this happen as discipline, punishment for the sins of the nation. Chapter 2, verse 21. Daniel, speaking about God, says, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to those who have understanding. He goes on. He reveals deep and hidden things and so forth. Daniel is saying, in the context of him about to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this is all about God. Chapter 4. In the chapter where Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. And why is he humbled? Well, it's an expression of God's sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar taking credit for something God had done. God says, I'm going to remind you who's God and who's not. And so you have the statement in verse 17 that's repeated in verse 25 that I quoted a minute ago. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever he will. Look down, same chapter, chapter 4, verses 34 and 35. This is Nebuchadnezzar after he's learned his lesson. I lifted my eyes to heaven. My reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High, praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. He does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Daniel, the book of Daniel, is about God. Chapter 5. Verses 25 through 28, talked about it a minute ago, when the finger writes on the wall. Well, all of that is a message that reminds the king of Babylon that verse 26, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom's divided, given to the Medes and the Persians. Well, all that's about God. So you see it on practically every page. There's an emphasis that God's doing this, God's doing that, or God is going to do this, that, or the other. All right, so the emphasis then in the book of Daniel on the sovereignty of God would serve the important purpose of offering encouragement to a captive people. Regardless of the difficulty of the here and now, the message throughout this book is that God still rules in the kingdoms of men, that God is still sovereign and always has been. And so if they would put their trust in God, then they could rest a little easier at night. And so there was a practical element to that in emphasizing the sovereignty of God. So just think about those, keep those things in mind as you read through Daniel's character and the emphasis on God and his sovereignty. All right. Let's do our survey. And I divide the book into two major sections. Chapters 1 through 6, the historical section. Okay, this is where, there's Daniel refers to himself or whoever happened to be recording this about Daniel, that section anyway, refers to Daniel in the third person. Daniel did this and he did that and so forth. And so here's how that section breaks down. And I've worded these subpoints this way because I think it focuses the attention again on the sovereignty of God. Chapter 1, God brings Daniel to Babylon. Okay, so this is at the beginning of the captivity, 606, when the first wave or the first deportation of people is taken out of Judah and to Babylon. Daniel is among that group, among the more noble class. His three friends also a part of that group. Chapter 2, God elevates Daniel. And he does that through Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream. We don't have time to go through all the details of that. But Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He wants to know what it means. But, and he has his own magicians and soothsayers that he's relied on in the past who want to come give him whatever their interpretation of it is. And it was the way it normally worked was a pretty easy task. If I told you what I dreamed last night, you could come up with something, right? So I dreamed that I was riding in my car down a very crooked road, and I swerved off into the ditch. Well, all right, okay, so the car represents your life. And the road represents, the direction of your life. That it's not always a straight, right? I mean, you could come up with something. You give me the contents, or I give you the contents of the dream. You can come up with something. This time Nebuchadnezzar said, no, first you got to tell me what I dreamed. Then tell me what it means. And if you can tell me what I dreamed, then I'll truly know that your interpretation of it is going to be accurate. Well, the soothsayers, they have a cow. They said, nobody, we can't do that. You've never asked that of us. No king has ever asked that. He said, well, that's the way it is. Well, ultimately, Daniel comes in, tells the king, all right, here's what you dreamed, and here's what it means. And it had to do with succeeding empires that would come and go throughout history. And in the aftermath of that, through that, Daniel is elevated to a place of prominence and authority in the kingdom. So God brings Daniel to Babylon. Then God elevates Daniel. Chapter 3, God saves 3 faithful servants. The fiery furnace incident. We'll save the details of that for one of our takeaways in just a moment. Chapter 4, God humbles an arrogant king. This was Nebuchadnezzar, getting a little too big for his britches, as we used to say when I was growing up. And God humbled him. Chapter 5, God overthrows a powerful nation. This the end of the Babylonian dominance, when the kingdom is taken from them and is given to the Medes and the Persians. And then chapter 6, God closes the mouths of lions. All right, so all of those things happen in the historical section, and every one of those things is an instance of God doing something, of God expressing His sovereignty in the lives of all those people. Now, chapter 7 through 12, we go from the historical section to the prophetic section. Chapter 7 through 12 basically contain a series of visions that God showed to Daniel, right? Prior to this, Daniel is interpreting the dreams and visions of others. Now God gives Daniel his own visions that Daniel then records, all right? And so you have the 4 beasts in chapter 7, which has it's a similar interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. It has to do with 4 succeeding world empires that would come on the stage of history. Chapter 8, the ram and the goat. A specific prophecy that deals with 2 of those 4 nations and has to do with the rise of Alexander the Great and the rise of the Grecian or Macedonian Empire under his direction. Side point, Josephus, the Jewish historian, uninspired, but I think his works are helpful. So for whatever this is worth, Josephus records that when Alexander the Great was making his way south down through the land of Canaan, down through the promised land area and conquering everything in his path, that when he came to Jerusalem, that some priests ran out to him with a copy of what we know as the book of Daniel, the scroll of Daniel, and showed Alexander what we know as chapter 8 as a prophecy that predicted that Alexander would come to the forefront and be a conqueror of the Medes and Persians and grow in power and all that. And that Alexander, because their prophets were predicting or did predict his success, he was kinder toward the Jewish people than he was to others that he conquered. Whatever that's worth, Josephus mentions that. All right, chapter 9, Daniel's prayer and a vision of God's kingdom, the 70 weeks vision, which we don't have time to go into in detail. Chapter 10, a messenger from God comes and speaks to Daniel and is going to reveal additional things to Daniel, specifically about these warring nations, chapters 11 and 12, that cover a lot of what we refer to as the intertestament period And there's just a long succession of references to the king of the north does this, the king of the south does this, and then the king of the north and the king of the south. And a lot of it has to do with the battles that would eventually exist among generals and nations that would come out of the downfall of Alexander's empire. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom, the vast Macedonian Empire, was split into 4 sections and given to 4 of his generals. 2 of those and their ancestors would become stronger than the other 2. The Ptolemies in the south in Egypt, the Seleucids in the Syrian region. And they would constantly be in at battle with one another. If you think about it geographically, Syria kind of to the north and northeast of the Promised Land, Egypt to the south and southwest of the Promised Land. You get those 2 factions fighting with each other. Who's caught right in the middle? Jerusalem and its area. And so all throughout that period, the Jewish people found themselves, for a time under the domination of the Ptolemies, the Egyptians, and then the Seleucids would conquer a little more, and then they'd come under Seleucid rule, and so it was just back and forth, a bad period of time for the Jewish people during that time. Chapters 11 and 12 deals with a lot of that. All right, so there's your survey of the contents of Daniel. Now some takeaways. We can be faithful to God even in the worst of circumstances. We already talked about that somewhat when we talked about the character of Daniel. But, the Bible's filled with examples of godly people who maintained their faith in difficult times. Joseph, Paul mentions in Philippians 4 Christians in Nero's household. That would have been a tough place to be a faithful Christian. All right? Well, Daniel reveals some outstanding examples too. One of those in chapter 3, the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar makes this golden image, schedules a dedication ceremony for it. All of his officials from the provinces are invited to attend. And the attendees are told, in no uncertain terms, bow down and worship the image or be burned up, be thrown into a furnace of fire. Those were your options. Well, some Chaldeans go to Nebuchadnezzar later and tell him that 3 of the Hebrews, 3 of the Jews, weren't doing that. And they were around the shack, in the shack, and under the bed we go, right? Isn't that their names? Right? Okay, you can take that home with you. That won't cost you a thing. All right, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I find it interesting that we always use Daniel's Jewish name, but we use the 3 friends' Babylonian names. I don't know. That's fine. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They defy the order. Nebuchadnezzar brings them before him and gives them a second chance. We're going to do this again. When I strike up the band, you better fall down and worship. He strikes up the band. They don't. And they tell him they're not going to. And so they are thrown into the fire. But they're not bothered by the fire. They come out of the furnace completely unharmed, unaffected. And it prompts Nebuchadnezzar to affirm the legitimacy of their God. Okay, so there's one example. We can be faithful to God even in difficult circumstances. The lion's den, another example of that, chapter 6. You got the conspiracy, verses 1 through 9. They want to use Daniel's faithfulness against him. Some of the people that don't like him want to do that. By making it illegal to pray to any god except the king himself, and violators will be thrown to the lions. Incidentally, talking about Daniel's character, how about predictable righteousness? The enemies of Daniel look to try to find something that they can accuse him of. And they say, we can't find anything. But we'll find something that has to do with his relationship with his God. And so they concoct this thing, knowing that Daniel's going to pray anyway. Predictable righteousness. Is your righteousness predictable? People know how you're going to react? All right, so that's the conspiracy. The response, verses 10 and 11, Daniel prays anyway. The sentence, verses 12 through 18, the king is reluctant, but Persian law is Persian law. It can't be revoked, so he's thrown to the lions, but the lions do nothing. The release, verses 19 through 28, he survives the night. The conspirators are then devoured by the same lions that refused to eat Daniel. So, but again, Daniel being faithful to God even in the worst of circumstances. All right, takeaway number 2. True faith does 3 things. This is not my original outline, but I like it. True faith does 3 things. This is all from chapter 3 and the fiery furnace incident. True faith knows the power of God. Look at chapter 3, verse 17. When the friends are being given the chance to avoid the furnace, they say they're not going to. They're not going to bow down. And so they say, verse 17, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Our God is able. True faith knows the power of God. He spoke and it was done. Psalm 33:9. He who built all things is God. Hebrews 11:3. He's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. Ephesians 3:20. All right? I mean, we just pile passage on top of passage that acknowledges the power of God. Okay? So true faith knows the power of God. God has the power to do whatever He wants, consistent with His own will. Does God have the power to heal cancer? Does He have the power to end hunger? Does He have the power to stop persecution? Does He have the power to prevent my loved one from dying? Yeah, He does. He has the power to do it. But true faith is more than that. True faith knows the power of God, but it also guards the freedom of God. Look at verse 18. But if not. Verse 17, our God is able to deliver us. But if not. True faith recognizes that God has the power to do whatever He wants to. But we may not know what God will do. And often we don't know what God's going to do. And this one's tough because we often try to predict what God will do or affirm what we think God should do. Sometimes you hear folks say, well, if you just pray this and God will... Really? We're going to step out there and say we know what God's going to do? Who has known the mind of the Lord? Who's been His counselor? Romans 11:33 and 34. We don't know nearly enough to counsel God on what God ought to do. So yes, true faith recognizes God's ability, but true faith also understands its own limited knowledge and respects God's will and allows God to do as God pleases and doesn't try to tell God what God is supposed to do. One writer said, faith does not predict God's ways, it simply holds to God's word. Faith obeys God's truth, it does not manipulate God's hand. Faith is not required to plot God's course, but only to obey God's command. And that's the last part. True faith holds the truth of God. End of verse 18, back to chapter 3. We will not worship. We will not serve your gods. What mattered to those 3 men, far more than deliverance from the furnace, was obedience. All right. They couldn't control what God would or would not do, but they could control themselves. And so they said, our God can deliver us. If He chooses not to, it makes no difference. We're not going to bow down to your image. We can waste a lot of time fretting over things we can't control, hoping, I guess, that our angst is going to make it better. I suggest that a better response is to double down on serving God and let Him handle what's out of our control. I suspect He's well able to do that. All right, last takeaway. Daniel demolishes dispensationalism. Say that 5 times fast and you can leave early. Dispensationalism is the doctrine that holds that Jesus failed to establish His kingdom when He came to earth in the first century. And so all the prophecies that predicted that He would establish that kingdom had to be postponed and are destined to be fulfilled when He comes a second time. At which time, we're told, the dispensationalist says, He will set up His kingdom, which will be a physical, political kingdom in the city of Jerusalem, and will reign over this kingdom on the earth for literally 1,000 years. 2 primary passages from Daniel disprove this theory and show it to be the false doctrine that it is. Daniel 2:44. In the days of these kings, and when you look at when you flesh out the prophecy, Daniel predicted 4 kingdoms: Babylon, which was in existence at the time, Medo-Persia, Macedonian or Greek, and then the Romans. And in the days of those kings, the Roman kings, God would set up His kingdom. Now, either the kingdom was established in the days of the Roman kings, or Daniel was a false prophet. Period. That's it. Those are your 2 options. But Jesus referred to Daniel not as a false prophet, but as a prophet. Matthew 24:15. So you can't, try as they might, the dispensationalists cannot harmonize their doctrine with Daniel 2:44. They think they can. They can't. The other is Daniel 7:13 and 14. Wish we had more time to dig into this. In this vision, Daniel says, I saw one likened to the Son of Man, who went to the Ancient of Days and there received a kingdom. Notice the preposition. The Son of Man goes to the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days is a symbolic or figurative reference to God. It refers to His eternity, right? It's an age thing, but it's referring to the eternality of God. The Ancient of Days is the Father. The Son of Man, prophetically Jesus, goes to the Ancient of Days and there receives His kingdom. Dispensationalism has that opposite. They have Jesus coming from the Ancient of Days to the earth to receive the kingdom. That's not what Daniel said was going to happen. When did Jesus begin reigning over His kingdom? When He ascended back to the Father. Acts 1 and 2. So, dispensationalists have it backwards. If you ever encounter one of a dispensationalist, ask them, you have 2 questions to ask them. One question, 2 possible answers. Ask them, when the prophets looked down the stream of time, Daniel or whoever, and saw the establishment of God's kingdom, when did they see that happening? Did the prophets see that happening in the first century, or did the prophets see that happening at the second coming? Right? One of those 2. Give them the opportunity to answer. If they say, the prophets saw it in the first century, then ask, well, why wasn't it established then? Were they not inspired of God? Did God not know it wouldn't work? Why shouldn't we consider them false prophets per God's own definition of a false prophet? Deuteronomy 18. If he predicts something and it doesn't come to pass, he's a false prophet. If the prophets saw it happening in the first century and it didn't, they're false prophets. Period. If they say, well, no, the prophets, when they saw the fulfillment, they saw it happening at the second coming. Okay, then what was Jesus doing trying to establish it when He came the first time? Did He not understand the prophets? His own prophets? That His own Spirit, 1 Peter 1, 10 to 12, was speaking in? Daniel demolishes dispensationalism. All right. Daniel served in unique circumstances, and he served faithfully. Leaves us a tremendous example. All right. You listened well, appreciate it. Next week, again, if God wills, we'll begin the minor prophets with a look at Hosea. Thank you much.